Mr. President, I appreciate the good words of my colleague from Kansas. He comes from a state where they understand that the role of the government should be limited. They understand the importance of living within your means, of not spending money that you don't have. And I suspect that the senator from Kansas has had a long and distinguished career in public life, but before coming to Washington, D.C. to serve in Congress, also was a state legislator. And my guess is that when he was a member of the state legislature in Kansas, that they had to balance their budget every year. And I would ask my colleague, Mr. President, if he could perhaps shed some light on what his state of Kansas does year in and year out in order to get their budget balanced, to make sure that they're not spending more than they take in. I think that's, as he pointed out, something that most families in Kansas, I would say most families in my state of South Dakota, those are decisions they have to grapple with all the time. And you don't always have the luxury of being able to just borrow more. Most states don't allow that. My state of South Dakota doesn't allow that. And also certainly not in our states, probably very conducive to saying we're just going to raise taxes on people and on small businesses, which requires then that we've got to make hard decisions about spending. And I would just, through the chair, ask my colleague from Kansas if perhaps that might have been the way they went about dealing with their fiscal crisis in the past.
Mr. President, I thank the gentleman from South Dakota and would indicate that, yes, Kansas is one of those states, one of those 49 states. In our Constitution, we are prohibited in almost all ways of living beyond our means. And it's been something that the Kansas legislature and governor has lived with throughout the history of our state, including in today's environment where an economic downturn creates the circumstance in which there is less revenues. And so the solution to the problem in Kansas is not a cry for more revenue. It's a recognition that spending in difficult times has to be reduced. It's the restraint that we desperately need in Washington, D.C. that's so common in state capitals and families and businesses across the country. And so while I've always indicated to Kansans, while we have this debate every year about how to balance the revenues with the expenditures, and it's not an enjoyable debate, we are fortunate in Kansas that we have to reach that conclusion, and it's something that we need in Washington, D.C. For a long time, the political talk of Washington is that we're too likely to spend and tax. Well, there's also a problem of spending and borrowing. And we are now suffering the consequence, and we are not immune from what we see in Greece and Italy and Portugal and Ireland. If we do not solve this problem that we face today in a responsible way, it will be solved for us by the markets, by those who we borrow money from, determining we are no longer credit worthy. We don't have to worry so much about that in Kansas because we have a constitutional provision that requires our legislature and governor to reach the right conclusion. And it's why I thought the debt ceiling was the opportunity for us to force ourselves. This debate on the debt ceiling was the opportunity for us to force ourselves to do the things that politicians don't always like to do. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, just to the point that the senator from Kansas was making, you talked about higher interest rates and the impact of not dealing with the fiscal circumstances the country finds itself in. And you look at what's happening in Europe. A 3-year government bond interest rates are around 19.4% for Portugal, 28.9% for Greece, and 12.9% for Ireland. Now, think about the impact in this country. If we had interest rates go back to what is even a 20-year average, we would see an additional $5 trillion, just about $5 trillion in additional borrowing costs in the next decade alone. That's if we went back to the 20-year historical average for this country. Not to mention going to what they're looking at in countries like Europe at these 19-20% interest rates. I mean, think about auto loans, think about home loans, think about student loans, think about business loans, all those things that we rely on in our economy and that families across this country rely on in order to carry on with their daily lives. If you were looking at those kinds of interest rates, well, that's the type of interest rate sensitivity that we have. And if we don't get our fiscal house in order, we could very well end up like many of these countries, and that would be devastating for our economy. And the most important thing that we can be doing right now, Mr. President, and the senator from Kansas pointed this out, is we need to put policies in place that actually grow the economy and create jobs. Now, I'm also will support the cut, cap, and balance proposal that's before the Senate today because I think it does important things. It cuts spending today immediately. It caps spending in the near term and puts in place a process by which we balance the budget in the long term, a balanced budget amendment. And it's interesting to know, if you go back historically, I want to read something for you, Mr. President, that President Ronald Reagan said 29 years ago this week. He led a rally of thousands of people on the Capitol steps calling for a balanced budget amendment. And this is what he said, and I quote, "Crisis is a much abused word today, but can we deny we face a crisis?" End quote. That's 29 years ago at a time, Mr. President, when the federal debt was $1 trillion. We face a debt 14 times as high, $14 trillion, and under the President's budget would literally double in the next decade. We have got to get our fiscal house and our spending in order. The senator from Kansas also mentioned the size of government as a percentage of our entire economy. If you go back to 1800, the formation, the early years of our country, 2% is what we spent on the federal government, 2% of our total economy. This year we're over 24%, in that 24 to 25% range. If you look at the 40-year historical average, it's about 20.6% is what we have spent as a percent of our entire economy. What does that mean? It means we are spending more at the federal level and that the private economy is shrinking relative to our total economy. What we want to see, Mr. President, is an expansion of the private economy, where we put policies in place that enable our job creators to create jobs, and that we get the federal government smaller, not larger. My view is when you're looking at a debt crisis like we are in this country, that you don't grow and expand the size of government, you make government smaller. You get the private economy growing and expanding and creating jobs. That is how you ultimately get out of this situation. Well, we've got policies in place right now that are making it more difficult and more expensive, I would argue, for our small businesses to create jobs. Anywhere you go in the country, in my state of South Dakota, elsewhere, you talk to small business owners, you talk to farmers and ranchers, what they will tell you is the policies, the regulations, the taxes coming out of Washington, D.C. make it more expensive and more difficult for our job creators to create jobs. And if you look at the data on that, it's pretty clear. I mean, since this president took office, we've got higher unemployment by about 18%. We've got 2.1 million more people unemployed than we did when he took office. We have a 35% higher debt. We saw spending go up in the last 2 years alone, non-defense discretionary spending by 24%. The number of people who are receiving food stamps in this country is up by 40%. All the data, all the tools by which we can measure economic progress and growth demonstrate that the policies that have been put in place by this administration have been a complete failure. And so what we need, Mr. President, is a change in policies. And it starts by capping federal spending or cutting federal spending, capping it in the near term, and putting in place a long-term solution, a balanced budget amendment, like so many states have in place, like the senator from Kansas mentioned that they have in his state of Kansas, like we have in my state of South Dakota, where our state governments have to live within their means. They cannot spend money they do not have. That is the problem that we have here in Washington, D.C. today. Now, in terms of our small businesses, there was a survey that was done by the Chamber of Commerce a couple of weeks ago in which they found that 64% of the small businesses who responded to the survey said that they're not going to hire this year. 12% actually said they're going to cut jobs. Why? Half of the small businesses listed economic uncertainty as the major reason. They are concerned about what's going to come out of Washington, D.C. They don't know what the policies and the regulations that are going to be imposed on them and what it's going to do to their cost of doing business. And as a consequence, they are just hunkering down and trying to survive. We need to change that. We change that by getting federal spending under control. Cut, cap, and balance is an important step in that process. And I'm pleased that the House of Representatives last night passed it, sent it over here to the Senate. We'll have an opportunity to vote on that in the next few days, Mr. President. And I would argue to my colleagues that this is fundamentally the best thing that we can be doing to get not only our fiscal house in order and get it on a more sustainable path going forward, but also to help get our economy growing again and get jobs created out there. You can't do it by making government larger. If that was the case, the $1 trillion stimulus bill that was passed last year would have brought unemployment down. But as we all know, we're facing 9.2% unemployment today. We continue to see an economy that is struggling, that's growing at a very slow rate. We need to unleash that economy, and the way that we do that is by capping or cutting spending in Washington, D.C., making federal government smaller, not larger, getting that amount of spending as a percentage of our entire economy back into a more historical norm, working to ensure that taxes and regulations stay low on our job creators in this country. And that's why I just fundamentally object to what the President and many of his allies here in Congress want to do with regard to the debt crisis, and that is increase revenues. You cannot create jobs in this country. You cannot grow the economy by increasing taxes on our job creators. I can't think of a single tax that you could put on our economy that actually would help create jobs. It will have the opposite effect, Mr. President. It will make it more difficult for small businesses to create jobs, more difficult for us to get out of this economic downturn. I hope my colleagues will support cut, cap, and balance, and that we'll get a big vote here in the Senate and get this country back on a more sound fiscal footing and on a path where we can create jobs and get this economy growing. Mr. President, I yield the floor.